Our third presentation is by myself. I'm not going to give a lengthy introduction of who I am. I am a program director for the Finken Foundation. I do a lot of work in Nagorno-Karabakh, mainly focusing on resettlement, strategic areas of Karabakh. I'm a former editor of the Armenian Weekly, and I am an elected official of the ARF. So talk about multiple identities. The topic of my talk, if I can remember it, is who are we and where are we going? Questions of Armenian cultural identity and political orientation. I'd like to start with a small short story. The short story is set in the early 1990s when men's college basketball in this country was dominated by the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Those of you who follow college basketball will recall in those days that UNLV's Running Rebels won a national championship in 1990 and nearly won a second national championship in 1991 with an all-black, all-inner-city team coached by a white guy, Jerry Tarkanian. On the eve of their second attempt in 1991, their leading scorer, Larry Johnson, who had a really sunny personality, gave wonderful, loquacious interviews, was interviewed by Sports Illustrated, and they asked him, Larry, how does it feel for an all-black, all-inner-city team to be coached by a white guy? He said, wait a minute. He goes, Coach Tark? He's not white. He's Armenian. Very illuminating. I thought that would be a good intro into the point that I'm trying to make here, which is that race is a malleable construct. Armenians are inherently no more white than they are brown or black or any other color. Race is especially malleable for people like ourselves who've been at the crossroads of competing cultures, civilizations, invading armies for millennia, or at least centuries. We've been engaged in so much cultural borrowing that any notion of national purity on our part is just impossible. So really what this points to is that race is a social construction. It's not etched in stone. It's pushed and pulled by contesting interpretations of who we are and who we want to be. Okay, it's also not only about who we want to be. Often notions of race are foisted upon us too. Let's not forget that. When Armenians came to this country in the first wave of the 20th century, right after the genocide, most of us were considered colored Europeans. We came along at around the same time when Italians came and Irish came. And that wave of immigration from Europe or Eastern Europe was not considered to be an immigration of whites. It was considered to be an immigration of lesser folks, somewhere between white and black. And Armenians only whitened over time, over generations, as both the society from above began to accept us as such, and homegrown, native-born American Armenians began to represent themselves as such. So how does this relate to today's topic? I'm not so interested here in talking about how others see us. I'm more interested in talking about how Armenians portray themselves, how Armenians represent themselves, culturally and politically. Both how we represent ourselves to others and how we represent ourselves to ourselves. Now clearly Armenians have had affinities with many peoples, many cultural groupings historically. Which ones we choose to emphasize, which one of those affiliations we choose to emphasize is a matter of interpretation, it's a matter of selection. How we emphasize them and to what end we emphasize our affiliations are also political choices. So in my remaining minutes, I'd like to just scratch the surface a little bit of this question. I'd like to examine a number of prominent orientations, if you will, that have occupied Armenian political discourse in the 20th century and have helped us to organize our solidarities. Who do we align with? Who do we affiliate with culturally and politically? These are the sorts of questions I want to briefly touch on and then propose some alternatives, alternative ways in which we might imagine our solidarity. One prominent orientation, if you will, is the Western orientation. Armenia as the little ally, as it were, which is something many of us have grown up to become familiar with in this country. The little ally was a term coined by Western officials. I can't remember if it was Clemenceau or Wilson or who it was, but Armenia was sort of patted on the head as the little ally of the West, who sent Armenians to fight in the French Foreign Legion, who helped in various ways the Allied cause during World War I as it fought the Axis powers. Or excuse me, in those days, Germany, Turkey, and Austro-Hungary, thank you. And the little ally as a mantra was something that not only was thrown upon us, but it was something that we eagerly devoured. It was something that many Armenians in the post-genocide era eagerly embraced. And I think there were political reasons for that and cultural reasons for that. Let me start with the political reasons. Certainly, Armenian political groupings, especially those of the nationalist bent, were looking to portray us here in this country as the little ally for the perks or the dividends it would hopefully provide for Armenia. We were the loyal, Christian, Euro-friendly people in the region, a region that was turbulent, not necessarily friendly to the West, hoping that the West would perhaps then embrace us. The whole notion of a mandate for Armenia that Wilson was considering was based on this premise, that Armenia could become an outpost for the West in these turbulent seas of the Near East. So we played to that image. We played to that notion. Similarly, it was a way of demonstrating cultural affiliation, that Armenians were somehow a civilized people, especially in those days when peoples of the East, unjustifiably I might add, were often considered to be barbarians, simply because they were Muslims or Arabs. Although, certainly in the case of the Armenian genocide, we might say that Turkish state-sponsored brutality certainly fit the term. But in any event, from a political standpoint, for many Armenians and Armenian nationalist groups, it really made sense to play ourselves up as the little ally of the West, hoping that there would be some crumbs at the table of Versailles or later on in the post-genocide era. But just as important, this wasn't just a lobbying tool or a tool of nationalist parties per se. Internally, the notion of the little ally took on a greatly important role for a people who had lost everything. It gave some dignity, some pride, some entitlement to people who had lost everything, it seemed, after genocide, and who had seen themselves practically erased, not just from Eastern Anatolia, but erased from the world's political map. In that vein, tying oneself to European civilization, in a sense, was identifying with the living, was in a sense identifying with the riches of the West and saying, we too must be counted. And in fact, many Armenian Americans over time came to view themselves as Euro or Anglo. And we would point to various attributes: our Indo-European language, our religion, our history as a people, often proudly calling ourselves the first Caucasians, even though other cases could certainly be made. And let's not forget that there was an Armenia well before there was even a Europe. I will argue, however, that this rhetoric, even with all of its benefits, it developed some very painful costs for us. First of all, it wasn't really true. We're not a European people. We can make a case for being a Middle Eastern people just as well. Or perhaps come up with a new hybrid variant that might even be more appropriate. But aside from being untrue, I think more deeply, this notion of the little ally led to a certain cultural dependency and a subordinate status that affected our people psychologically. In order to really make political gains, intercession of others was required. The good offices of others were required. And it took a long time, I would say probably till the 1970s, when groups through civil disobedience and later armed struggle really began to put up their dukes and said, you know what, we're not going to wait for the good offices of others, we're going to take matters into our own hands. It was only then, I think, that a new political identity forged on self-reliance and forged on non-alignment really came into being. I would say even worse, the notion of the little ally, if applied uncritically, can lead into very dangerous political positions. I mean, there were times during the Cold War where Armenians were known to say, to be a good Armenian is to be a good American. Somehow to support U.S. policy on this or that issue was in the best interests of Armenians, ipso facto, by definition almost. That, of course, is an extreme, but it was an extreme one would hear not infrequently at that time. That, I would argue, is really taking things to an extreme that is untenable. Those of you may recall who were around in the 50s how many Armenians, particularly Armenians in the nationalist camp, in the Dashnak camp, would identify with the so-called captive nations. Nations that had been absorbed into the Soviet Union, mostly unwillingly. To that extent, the notion of captive nations certainly carried cachet and was justified. But the notion was that we relied on the U.S. as the liberator of these captive nations. And when the time came and the Soviet Union fell, the U.S. frankly didn't do much to help those captive nations. The Baltics in particular were outraged that after all the promises following World War II, the U.S. didn't do anything to facilitate their independence when the chips were down. And I think this was part of the problem, is that we developed a complex, almost like a tragic lover, when the U.S. or the Western powers would not stand behind all the noble verbiage that they threw at the Armenian people. And we found that we got very little in return for our loyalty, for our adherence to Western values. And eventually, for some of us, I think it wore off in the 70s when people began to realize that fact and words did not necessarily come together. That Wilson may have spoken very finely about democracy, but the U.S. in fact was not a democracy, and it was not benign. And in fact, the U.S. operated as an imperialist power, and Turkey was its client state in the region. And I think when people woke up to that notion, the idea of the little ally began to fade, although it certainly has left many traces upon our consciousness. This is one example of an orientation, if you will, a Western orientation codified in that motto or mantra. We can think of other orientations too. Certainly there's a Russian orientation in Armenian political discourse and cultural discourse. There's a Russian orientation from a political standpoint here in the diaspora. There were many people, people in the Ramgavar party, people in the Hochakyan party, Bolsheviks and others, who said that Armenia's path, Armenia's destiny lay with Russia. And again, this orientation carried certain justifiable points. Theorists would argue that, look, when Armenia's principal threat is pan-Turkism, when genocide didn't simply mean 1.5 million, but meant possibly wiping Armenians off of the map from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea and beyond, what stood in the way? Russian power. Whether you liked the Russians or not, whether you thought of them as benign or evil, Russian force somehow served as a way of holding back our principles. You see both political dimensions and cultural dimensions to dependency. But again, I would argue that in either case, whether you look at a Western orientation or a Russian orientation, the inclination is to look up, to look above, to a big brother whose good offices are required to help you deliver the goods at the end of the day. Now, I'm not here to question the need for strategic partnerships. I'm not here to question the need for lobbyists. We need lobbyists in Washington to secure support from Congress on this or that issue. We need lobbyists in Moscow and Brussels and other European capitals, etc. I'm not questioning that. What I am questioning is the notion of how to construct political solidarities. There's a difference. There's a difference between lobbying and having political solidarities with others who share your cause. There's a key difference. And here I'm not simply talking about the need for self-reliance. Earlier I talked about the 1970s and how Armenians put up their dukes and said, you know what, we're not going to wait for others to do our fighting for us, we will do it ourselves. Certainly you've seen that elsewhere. in the early 90s in Karabakh, you saw that as well. While self-reliance and the notion that Armenians must resolve their own issues is a very strong galvanizing force, I don't think we should throw out the notion of political solidarities. We need political solidarities. They create discussions above and beyond ourselves. They take us out of our own kitchen, out of our own living room, and engage us with other ideas, other cultures, other ways of seeing. But I would argue the most natural, the most life-giving political solidarities aren't with these imperialist superpowers or with these larger civilizations, which are highly fraught with pitfalls and contradictions, with many, in fact, modernizing impulses, but also many exploitative, even genocidal impulses as well. I would argue, in fact, that many of our most life-giving and natural alliances, solidarities, are to be found laterally. And perhaps this is banal. Perhaps this is something you've all thought of. But really, you look around us, there are peoples that share geopolitical interests with us, cultural trajectories with us, who often inhabit the same spaces as us. Think of the Kurds, for example. Forging solidarities with such groups will provide, of course, practical benefits. But above and beyond the practical benefits, these solidarities, and not just the Kurds, Cypriots, Palestinians, you can go further afield and say, why not the Native Americans? Okay, it's a stretch in the sense that the Native Americans evolved separately from the Armenians. We don't have a similar region to call home. But in this era of globalization, where images are beamed to you from halfway across the world, and hybridity has become part of everyday practice, why not? Why not say that Native Americans are soul brothers just as much as the Kurds or the Palestinians? What we need to do is root our political solidarities, I would argue, in objective reality. And the objective realities are that small peoples of the world get the shaft. They get the short end of the stick, usually at the hands of imperialism. And if we are to forge political solidarities and recognize imperialism for what it is, then our most natural allies are other peoples who have met the same fate, other peoples that are interested in strategizing the same ways that we are. Peoples who understand what it means to have suffered displacement, occupation, genocide. And frankly, by doing so, there are many practical benefits. Just think of the ways in which we can amplify our voices, amplify our resources, and do many other things simply by reaching out laterally rather than upwardly. And again, I want to repeat, I'm talking about political solidarities, not about the need for lobbying or rubbing elbows. I view pro-Armenian congressmen as resources that should be cultivated. But it's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to say that our friend in Congress is somehow naturally our friend and ally. We know that's not the case. Most of them are paid to become our friends.
You can apply that money to buy a cultural center.
Yes.
Similar.
Yes.
That could have similar.
You're a perfect segue into our discussion. So I don't want to belabor the point. I think you've got my message here. I want to thank you for your patience. This has been quite a panel. And unfortunately, we cannot take questions because there's another panel that's due in here right now. So we thank you, and we'll take your questions over lunch.
That's not fair.
5 minutes. I would take 5
Can't
minutes.
do this.
Hold on a second. When is the next panel?
12.
We can delay by 15 minutes?
Yeah, you can't ask us.
Okay. Listen to me. We'll take 10 minutes of questions, and then we'll have to wrap it. Okay. I'll just field the questions, and then I'll direct them to who they're intended for. Yes. Yes.
You're talking about progressive artists and their role in contributing to political identity. What, as young artists that are progressive, can we do to kind of like further the establishment of perhaps a community cultural center here in Manhattan that is a kind of like a place for a haven for musicians and artists and people to come together and like do what they need to do? And where do you see that going?
Well, very good, to be honest with you. Right now, there are two institutions under construction. Okay, one of them is in Washington D.C. and it's a genocide museum, which I think is a calamity because genocide is only one part of our identity. I think it should be an Armenian museum, perhaps genocide/genocide memorial. You know, and I do understand and respect, what they're. Again, it's about lobbying and not about something else. Finally, but the same patron is creating a contemporary art museum in Yerevan, which is very, very promising.
Is that the David
And
Hudson?
that's the David Hudson. I wish I had time to show you the images. It's a fantastic building, very progressive, and I'm glad it kind of went to a non-Armenian because Armenian architecture is suffering. We do not have current contemporary Armenian architecture. It's simple as that. I know some people are pissed about that, man, but maybe this will get them off their rear ends and stuff like that. So, as to what the mission of the Contemporary Art Museum in Yerevan is going to be, who's going to run it, whose political hand is going to, what sensibility, we don't know yet. We hope to learn about it, and I think we will. But get on David Hudson's it's a website and check out engineering. It's a genius what he's doing, and plus he's training a generation of young architects there, which means the translation of internationalism should be a little more smoother rather than taking in everything that comes from outside, mimicking it and then regurgitating, which is a lot of what you see.
Okay, we'll move over here. Yes.
I'm in Armenian, and I didn't think it was so unbelievable. The old church, the original church in New York a few years back was for sale at very little. I mean, like almost in today's dollars what we sold it for then. And I thought it was right next door to the guy.
Sweetheart, it would not go. It would not. Church money will not go to a cultural center because they don't want to channel the money that way. They don't want it. I can show you visually evidence how the church dictates what aesthetics is, okay? What artists should do, what art is, what music is, what literature is, okay? I can show you, but I don't have time. I'm telling you, it's not going to come from the church, and don't depend on the church. It's not going to come. Let them do their spiritual need, not culture.
I want to give other people an opportunity. Yes.
Okay, I was looking to tie in all three of your discussions earlier, and I found it very interesting that you referred to Gorky's work, interestingly enough, and his life, as a representation and a cross-section of how Armenians have, progressed throughout the 20th century, and how you said that they don't have support from their communities in general, and they don't fit into the mainstream, and places where they don't know how to define themselves. And I also found that, how Mr. Derogassian was also talking about how we should find these new channels of where we can fit into ourselves. So my question to you guys is, do you think that a new social forum is kind of our niche now of like the Armenians around the world finding a place where they can identify themselves and their cause a little bit better? And coming from a time when we didn't have a place where we could fit and now we do you think that?
We still don't.
No, well, I'm asking, do you think the social forum is a new place for us and a new place to advance our cause?
It's certainly a progressive option, one option among others. I will sustain that that's the way we should engage with the process of globalization, and not the way in which we are engaged now, both in Armenia and the world, the diaspora. But it's just an option. I mean, it's not absolute. It's discussion. We can't debate about that. This is the way I see it. This is the progressive way to engage with the world.
Over here.
I'm wondering if the word that we're using, globalization, perhaps would be a better word would be cosmopolitanism. And this idea of, if you look at the history, kind of from the 20th century on, Armenians, along with other groups of the third world, if you want to use that term, have always sort of been, there's been this kind of intellectual mass that's been looking out. And I think that that's sort of what connects all of what you're talking about in terms of different solidarities and thinking about a different type of world that's more, it's not necessarily about identity and its very kind of rooted term, kind of connected to the national, but more about kind of what does it mean to be this idea, be an exile, and the power that's actually within that homelessness, rather than just thinking homelessness is a bad place, thinking of it as a very creative space, which I think you see somebody like Gorky and some of these other artists inhabiting. That's sort of, to me, the power of the Armenian diaspora, and honestly, the Middle East in general is a place of great mixture. So I'm wondering with the things like these cosmopolitanism and building on some of the work of Anthony Appiah as of late and some of these other kind of recent theorists, even thinking of Edward Said's work. And I was just kind of posing that to you, if you don't have that difficulty.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can look at exilation background. I mean, that's the title of the presentation, exilation. That means they're better off being exiled from community, from mainstream. But that's easier said than lived, you know. You see what these artists go through, I mean, and their histories are not being written. And if you leave it up to the mainstream, they're going to stick with Gorky. Every 100 years, they'll give you one name. Do you understand? So who's going to come to balance that gap? It's community structures and organizations, and they're not doing it. Simple. Do you understand? So I don't know what you want to call it, cosmopolitan. I find preventionism sometimes phenomenally global and phenomenally cosmopolitan. But so these are words that, I mean, I've seen globalism in a lot of it blew my mind away, man. You know? So I don't know. I don't know about these terms. They're fantastic. Once in a while they come and go. They're like gauges. It's good. But let's not get stuck there.
I'm a social scientist, so I'm more sensitive towards terms and concepts. And no, I don't think that cosmopolitanism is the right term to use. I think that cosmopolitanism is far away from political engagement with identity. It creates another identity. Yes, maybe you can think in that way. But I don't think that right at this stage of, let's say, human development, which I call the late modernity or hyper-modernity, I don't think that cosmopolitanism is anything more concrete than fiction. I don't think that it could be applied to the Armenian. I'd rather use identity, diaspora, and globalization.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll close. Yes.
Yeah, I have two comments. One, I would really like to see the term or the concept of the fact for the diaspora in this perspective. I mean, the Armenian diaspora did not start in the 1980s. That started in the 10th century. However, the historic perspective really affects the concept that we have on the name of diaspora. And then the other comment as far as the following, when you talk about solidarity, you have to consider the ideological dimension. Is communism or socialism? Does it create an ideological ground? When you talk about solidarity, what's the place of ideology?
Well, I think in the span of this short presentation, I probably didn't give sufficient shrift to ideology. Certainly, when we talk about solidarities, when we speak in these civilizational terms, in Western orientation, Russian orientation, those are very broad brush treatments, because obviously the Western orientation has its sub-orientations. You can identify with the neocons, you can identify with progressives in the U.S., although I would say the progressive movement here is probably at low ebb. But certainly you can't simply classify orientations in cultural terms. There's a class component, there's an ideological component. Identifying with one or another culture can't stop there. It has to identify with how that culture views politics, and that means ideology, sure.
Just quickly, yes, Dr. Dadoyan, thank you. It's a good point. As far as research, of course, the Armenian presence outside the homeland is a historical fact, and in that sense, yes, we might put diaspora in that historical context. But the concept of diaspora as engagement with identity started to be used and became an identification with the national ethos after the genocide. before that we never used spür, we used banka or something else. Spür became a concept that entered in our everyday, let's say, discourse after 1915. So I think that there is a break in 1915 with genocide, with this, historical context of Armenian peasants outside the homeland. On the other hand, I also sustain that the Armenians who came out from Soviet Armenia, especially after 1991, they are not a diaspora. They are closer to what an economy, immigration is. And if you compare the cases, they are more similar with people from El Salvador living in the United States and sending remittances to their home country, to their homeland, than with the traditional concept of diaspora, which is closely linked to Western Armenian culture and Western Armenians. And in that sense, I mean, I will go further. I will not think about Iran and the Armenian community in Iran as diaspora, nor about the Armenian community in Istanbul as diaspora. So diaspora is very much the consequence of genocide. And of course, I'm using assumptions, definitions of the concept, not just the fact.
Great. Discussing Armenia, does the concept of exclusion, very complex,
Yeah.
does it serve the history?
Yes, it should.
Okay, folks, thank you for your indulgence.